Ghost number 154 by Michele Sheldon. My first ever ghosts were two goblins in flat caps. They liked to push their pickled walnut faces into mine as I lay trapped in my cot, trying to quieten my screaming with their whisky breath shushes. They were cowards, though, because as soon as Mum appeared at the doorway, they always faded into the wall like half-finished portraits. The fat scissor lady was ghost number 3. She wore a purple nylon dressing gown and matching fluffy mule slippers, which miraculously hung onto her feet as she hovered in our sitting room, slashing at an invisible enemy in the ceiling with a pair of scissors. Mum would ask, "What are you looking at, Emma Jane?" And I'd say, "I'm looking at nothing, Mummy," because I'd learnt from years of screaming at the wrinkly goblins that no one but me can see them. Then when I was 6, we moved into a new house on a huge estate, and I thought, hooray, I'll get away from the drunk goblins and the fat scissor lady. And all was quiet on the ghost front until I went into the garden. And there was ghost number 4 waiting for me. A young man in stripy blue pyjamas, weeping, his throat all bloody, jiggedy-jaggedy flesh. I offered him a fruit salad chew to cheer him up, but he looked straight through me, as if I was the ghost. When Mum's friends visited, she'd say to them, "You'd think she'd be cock-a-hoot now we have a nice big garden with a swing and a climbing frame. But she never wants to go out, do you, Emma Jane? Don't know she's been born." And I'd stand there, feeling my cheeks burn, wanting to say, "I'd like to see you lot try and enjoy yourself with all that sobbing in the background." As I grew older and my world expanded, the number of ghosts I encountered dramatically increased. Most of my friends' memories on school trips were prompted by what particular chocolate bar or packet of crisps they'd eaten. Mine was whatever ghost I'd chanced upon. Dover Castle was the worst, prompting me to start my ghost spotter's notebook. During the hour-long tour of the secret wartime tunnels, we were followed around by a blonde-haired soldier dressed in Second World War uniform, repeatedly shouting, "Where's Annie?" When we got to the underground hospital, a man, naked except for his guts spilling out, ran past us screaming that he wasn't ready to die. Then in the Napoleonic... Oh, no. I knew this was going to happen. Napoleonic war tunnels, a grubby-faced soldier was stomping up and down the corridor, yelling at these little boys dressed in rags, who were struggling to carry buckets of water. There was even a ghost hanging around in the toilets, a teenage boy banging a large drum next to me as I washed my hands. I learnt to accept that things were not always what they seemed in my life. Like one of those rare sunny winter days when the sun is so low it casts impossibly long shadows, transforming stumpy oak trees into elegant poplars, and the washed-out greens and yellows of the countryside into a semi-Van Gogh landscape. After reading various books and journals on ghosts, I came to the conclusion that I was adept at seeing things from another dimension, just as others were good at knitting or playing football, or for whatever reason I could tune into the space where the dead were trapped. I told no one about what I could see. I saw no point in exposing myself to ridicule. Perhaps if the ghosts had been able to communicate with me and I with them, then I would have done so. Indeed, sometimes I fantasized about having the gift of clairvoyance, of being able to help them pass over, though where over was, I was unsure. My mother worshipped at the new shopping centre, and my father the local pub. And I was deeply suspicious of religion after learning that our neighbours, the Meeks, 3 worm-torturing boys, would be inheriting the earth. Anyway, a future career as a clairvoyant was ruled out by the fact that the ghosts I saw rarely took any notice of me. Instead, I became a solicitor. After qualifying, I moved to London for my first job and began to regularly see the ghost of a young girl in the flat opposite, ghost number 154, according to my notebook. Now, London's ghosts are a cut above those that frequented the seaside town I grew up in. For a start, their ethnicity was far more varied, reflecting the city's cosmopolitan nature. But without sounding too glib, their ghostly states were more interesting. Apart from a few drowned smugglers and my household and garden ghosts, my old stomping ground was full of depressed people who'd thrown themselves off the cliff to the rocks below. London was inhabited by a far wider range of troubled souls. For example, just on my short walk to Finsbury Park tube station in the morning, I was often accompanied by an elderly Turkish man who had been hit by the 341 bus, swearing and cursing every time one went by. Then there was the handsome teenager with a stab wound to his stomach, slumped on the pavement of Riversdale Road, and the young Jewish lady pushing a pram near the station entrance, asking passers-by if they'd seen her baby. In the evening, I'd see families on green lanes emerging from their bombed-out houses, white-haired and blooded, staring up at the dust and debris of their homes, ripped apart to expose bedrooms, bathrooms, and sitting rooms like trash dolls' houses. On every street and every corner lurked some ghost wanting to replay its last few moments after death. At the end of the day, I was pleased to climb up to my top-floor flat, shut the door, and close the curtains to my other world. The flat was located in the centre of 3 identical blocks arranged around a large garden opposite Clissold Park. As such, all the flats had a wonderful view across the park and its 2 lakes, which lent them an air of calm, despite the constant growling of traffic and emergency service sirens on the nearby green lanes. Best of all, the flat was ghostless. I was lodging with Mel, a senior lawyer from the company who'd been seconded to work on a project in Dubai. So I had the place to myself. She'd only lived there for 6 months and knew about as much about the other occupants as I did. I'd moved in during the winter months, leaving for work and returning in the darkness, with little chance to get to know any of the residents, apart from the occasional hurried greeting. But from what I could gather at weekends, they were either affluent young professionals working in the city or retired elderly folk, like the couple living with ghost number 154. Their flat was in the block next to mine, built at an angle so that if you stood on one side of the balcony doors, you could just about see into their front room. The first time I saw the girl was during the weekend I moved in. I'd been putting up a photo of my parents when I had that eerie feeling you get when someone is watching you. I looked up, and there she was, standing near the balcony windows, dressed in a dark headscarf and a lime green 1980s-style shell suit, staring out across the park towards the playground in the distance. Then the elderly man appeared and drew the curtains together. The next time I saw her was the following weekend, early afternoon, as I hoovered the sitting room. Again she was standing, gazing at the park, the playground beyond, probably where she'd spent most of her childhood running around with her friends. I noticed how big the dark circles were under her eyes. I ducked out of sight as the elderly man appeared with his wife. I didn't want them to see me and think I was a nosy neighbour. After a few moments, I glanced back. The curtains were closed. I went back to hoovering, trying to shake off the sadness that had settled over me since seeing the ghost. She looked exhausted, and I recognised that kind of tiredness as one that accompanies a serious illness like my friend Ty had suffered. He'd been diagnosed with leukemia, aged just 12, about the same age as the girl's ghost, and had died 18 months later. Though I'd become hardened by seeing so many ghosts encountering the young always made me think of Ty. I assumed that the girl must have been their daughter and that, like my friend, childhood leukemia or some other cancer had killed her. I imagined the long, drawn-out trauma that she and her family must have gone through and wondered whether they ever felt her presence or if they were too consumed by grief to notice. Over the next few months, I became more and more obsessed by the girl and her parents, or rather with the idea that I could bring them some kind of peace by telling them that she'd never left them. But I only ever saw them once or twice at weekends, as infrequently as their daughter. The father always looked harassed, as if being pursued by swarms of biting and stinging insects. The woman always hidden under a voluminous headscarf, always hurrying behind. I bade them hello each time, but they barely acknowledged my presence, sometimes ignoring me. Death, as I knew from Ty's parents, can be catching. His death killed their marriage, and every time I saw the ghost parents, I realised they must have died too. During the spring, I began to see the ghost daughter more often. The weather had turned unreasonably warm, allowing me to sit on the balcony early evenings and at weekends. In fact, I saw her standing overlooking the park so frequently, I began to place my chair with my back to her. But her presence was always so intense that I could never resist turning for a moment to acknowledge her. And there she'd be, always standing, away from the door, as if scared to be seen, staring out longingly at the park, dressed in the same brown headscarf and shell suit. The heat wave came to an end on a Sunday evening after the storms it had brewed exploded across London, turning roads into rivers and joining the two lakes opposite. I'd been reading my book in the sitting room when I heard an almighty crash. It sounded like someone had turned over one of the large recycling bins at the back of the flats. But when I heard the heavy rain against the balcony windows, I realised it was just thunder. I broke off from my book and opened the curtains to watch the veiny lightning dance across the sky, the thunder grumbling then rolling towards another neighbourhood. Out of habit, I glanced over at the ghost flat, 1 second empty and dark inside, the next lit up by a flash of lightning, the ghost daughter's face up against the doors, staring out at the storm, and then turning and catching my eye. I shut the curtains and bolted back onto the sofa, feeling an icy finger on the back of my neck. And as I recalled her face, I realised the dark circles around her eyes weren't caused by an illness. They were bruises. The white lightning had shown me something else too. She had opened her mouth as if to speak. Sleep refused to come that night as I recalled the terrible bruising to her face, my mind whirring with all the new theories as to how she died. I only fell asleep in the early hours after settling on a car accident as the probable cause. Her parents racked with guilt for surviving. Or perhaps one of them was the driver of the doomed vehicle. I avoided the balcony for the next few weeks and kept the curtains closed day and night. Even during the day, I was unable to shake off the image of the bruising to her face. But it wasn't just her injuries that unsettled me. I'd had years of bumping into maimed, headless, limbless and bloodied ghosts. This ghost was different, more troubling, and I realised it wasn't because of her age either. She'd been gazing out at the storm and had purposefully looked at me and opened her mouth to say something. But what? To tell me something? Give me a message? A warning from the grave? Whatever it was, I didn't want to know. The more I thought of what had been unsaid, the more monstrous the ghost became. Every night I'd huddle down in my duvet, trying to block out the thoughts of her mouth opening into a demonic scream. I was frightened for the first time in my life. Well, could you blame me? After years of being mostly ignored by ghosts, here was one who looked directly at me and wanted to make contact. I had to get away. Coincidentally, an old school friend had asked me a few weeks before if I wanted to move in with her near Old Street, and I emailed Mel, giving her a month's notice, saying I was finding the flat too lonely. The following week, I was on holiday, visiting a friend in Spain for a fortnight. Once back, I'd have just 1 week left in the flat. My friends lived in the countryside outside Cadiz, and I spent my holiday playing with their 2 children, lazing by the pool, sleeping and drinking too much wine, all helping to blur my memories of the ghost daughter. Gradually, she became less vivid, less terrifying, less real. By the 2nd week, I no longer awoke with a jolt, seeing her face pushed up against the balcony door, her red mouth opening into a gaping, bottomless chasm capable of swallowing me whole. I'd convinced myself that the stark white of the lightning had created an optical illusion, making me think she was staring at me, trying to talk to me. But my theory melted away as soon as I got off the bus near the flats and saw the elderly Turkish man waiting, and I quickly resolved to keep my head down all the way home and not to glance up until I reached the front door. However, as I turned into the driveway, I found my way barred by 2 policemen busily retying "crime scene, do not cross" tape across the entrance. Beyond, I could see 2 police cars parked outside the flats and a young couple I recognised from my block talking to a woman who was hurriedly scribbling down something in a notebook. "Excuse me, can you tell me what's going on?" I called out to the 2 policemen. The taller of the 2 turned and walked away as his radio came to life. His colleague half smiled in apology and came towards me. "Been anywhere nice?" he said, gesturing to my suitcase. Spain. Can you tell me what's going on? I live here." He glanced behind him at his colleague, now speaking into the radio, then turned back to me. "Suppose you'll soon find out enough." "Find out what?" I said, suddenly worrying that Mel had returned home and something had happened to her. The blood began to drain from my face as another thought came. I'd read rare cases of poltergeists who'd harmed the living. Had the ghost daughter mistaken Mel for me and somehow hurt her? "Body was found this morning," he said, pointing behind him. My eyes followed his finger to the very balcony window I'd resolved not to look at. "The top flat?" He nodded. "They've picked him up at Heathrow," interrupted the tall policeman who'd wandered back. "He killed his wife?" I wondered aloud, thinking again of how destructive the father's grief must have been, driving him mad over the years and even to murder. "What? No," said the tall policeman. "The wife turned herself in a couple of hours ago." "For what?" "For murder." "Murder?" I repeated in a daze. "Yeah, we think she was trafficked." I looked at him blankly. "You know, modern-day slavery." "What, his wife?" But as the words left my mouth, the answer hit me. I felt the bile rising up from my stomach as I listened to the policeman tell me what I'd only just realised. "No, the girl. She was only 13, poor love. Kept her locked up most of the time. We don't know how long for. She didn't stand a chance against those 2 monsters." I felt my knees turn to jelly. My knuckles tightened around the suitcase handle for support. "You okay?" he asked, untying the tape and gesturing for me to come through. My heart was thumping so loudly in my head that his voice sounded like it was breaking through from another dimension. "DC Trilby will need to question you. Routine, that's all. See if you ever saw her."